much. It's my first time speaking in Mexico. I'm very, very pleased to be here today. We have a slight technical difficulty. Before the stock market crashed, there was a very popular economic theory, which basically said that human beings were rational, that we would make all of our decisions in our own enlightened self-interest, the Homo economicus theory. There's a similar kind of optimism about the human mind expressed by Steven Pinker, who's been here several times. In the book How the Mind Works, Steven Pinker argued that the visual system of the human being is about as well engineered as you could possibly imagine. And then he said, if the visual system is very well engineered, what about the rest of the brain? What about the parts that allow us to make decisions, to interpret things, to act on what we see? If vision works, why not the rest of the mind? And there's a similar optimism throughout a lot of the field known as evolutionary psychology, which we will hear about a number of times in the next couple of days. And the argument is that natural selection is what's called a hill climbing process. So it takes small, gradual steps, and over time, the best of the choices that are available tend to be chosen. And John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, the founders of evolutionary psychology, said because of the immense number of alternatives that appear over the vast expanses of evolutionary time, natural selection tends to cause the accumulation of superlatively engineered functional designs. But as an American, Groucho Marx once said, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? If you think about it, there might still be a few bugs left in the system. Is it really reasonable to think of the human mind as superlatively well engineered? I think we can all think of examples of not so good reasoning. And the famous philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, it's been said that man is a rational animal. All my life I've been searching for evidence which could support this. So what I want to ask today is, how do we reconcile evolution in all its power with the manifest clumsiness of the human mind? If evolution is so great, why is Bertrand Russell still searching for evidence that man really is Homo economicus? Well, I think there are two things to think about in the argument about superlative engineering of the human mind. The first is time. So it's fine to think that vision is well engineered because vision is very old. We share our visual systems with all of the mammals on the planet, all the vertebrates on the planet to some extent. So vision has evolved for hundreds of millions of years. That's a long time for evolution to get things right. But when we think about human beings, the things we care about most, like how we make decisions, how we reason rationally, how we're conscious, how we use language, those things are much more recent. Those things might be only a few 100,000 years. That's only a blink in the eye of evolution. So that's not much time, and what is very new may not yet be fully debugged. So you might think of human beings in all of our conscious activities as sort of like beta tests, not necessarily fully debugged. The second reason to wonder about how powerful evolution is with respect to shaping the human mind is the landscape of evolution. So a common metaphor Richard Dawkins uses, for example, is the idea of hill climbing or of climbing Mount Improbable. So I have on the diagram Mount Fuji, which is a nice smooth mountain. And if you can imagine, even a blind mountain climber could get to the top eventually by following a simple strategy. Take small steps, go up if you can, but never go back down. Eventually, if you followed that strategy, you would get to the top of the mountain. This is very effective for very simple traits, but it might not be effective for more complicated traits. So imagine that you followed that same strategy. Take small steps, go up but never go down, and you did that in the Himalayas. Well, that's a much more jagged surface, a jagged landscape. And in a jagged landscape, what can happen is you can get caught in what an engineer would call a local minimum or local maximum. You get to a point that's higher than anything else around, but much higher than the snow line. So you have something that works, but doesn't work very well. A good example of this is the human spine. The human spine is a lot better than nothing in terms of making a bipedal creature. So our human spines allow us to stand upright, which allows us, frees our hands, allows us to hold things in our hands to use tools, and that separated us from any other species, all other species in some ways on the planet. But it's a very clumsy design, so many in this room will have experienced back pain and cursed the design of the human spine. We have a single column that supports 70% of our body weight. A single column is kind of like a flagpole Flagpoles are good for holding up the weight of little pieces of cloth that flap in the breeze, but we have the heaviest brain per body size on the planet supported by that single column. So when you have a design that's clumsy and inelegant, engineers call that a kludge. If it gets the job done, but you could imagine doing a lot better. I believe the word in Spanish is apaño. Here is a good example of another kludge. There was a graduate student in University of Texas who couldn't afford to have a proper air conditioner in his car. So he took a blowtorch and duct tape. You always find duct tape in kludges. He put together the air conditioner on top of the car, the house air conditioner on top of the car. So it wasn't the most elegant ride on campus, but it got the job done. So that's a kludge. Clumsy, inelegant, but good enough. Engineers often make kludges because they're in a hurry. One of the most famous ones was on Apollo 13. People were in a space capsule. They had the wrong kind of air filter, and people figured out how to use duct tape, always part of the kludge, and socks and so forth, and they made a substitute air filter, and that allowed the astronauts to make it back home. But that doesn't mean that if you were building an air filter with the luxury of time that you would build it anything like that. And I don't know how popular this television show is in Mexico, but in America we have a show called MacGyver. And MacGyver every week would make a different kludge. He would make running shoes out of duct tape and the floor mats of his car, for example. And the famous slogan was, "What would MacGyver do if all he had were spare parts?" So kludges are about putting spare parts together in new but not necessarily the most efficient ways. Evolution builds kludges for several different reasons. The first of them is evolution has no foresight. So it's not like some intelligent designer said, I'd like to make a bipedal creature, I'd like it for it to be intelligent, for it to be nice to other members of its species and so forth, and I'd like it to be upright. Well, what would be the best way to make it upright? The first thing an intelligent designer might say is, I'll try a single column and support the weight. And the intelligent engineer would say, no, that's not a very good solution. Maybe I'll use 3 columns instead. I'll make a tripod. That'll support the weight better. Or I'll have 4 columns and shock absorbers, and the creature will be able to go over bumps. So an intelligent engineer could have done a much better job. Conversely, evolution has no hindsight. Evolution can't say, well, I built this human species, and they're really clever in a lot of ways. They've developed philosophy, they can talk about abstract ideas, they can have democracy and so forth, and yet they're really kind of mean to each other. A lot of them are selfish. I'd really like to kind of iron out the bugs, right? There's no intelligent engineer in evolution to do that either. And maybe worst of all, evolution is always in a hurry. There's no opportunity to take the species offline and say, in a couple of years, we'll release humans 2.0. We're stuck with what we've got. So the moral of the first part of what I've talked about today is a simple one. We can't expect evolution to be perfect. Evolution can do a really good job in a blind way, as Richard Dawkins has talked about, but that doesn't mean we should expect it to do a perfect job. And I want to talk a little bit about the particular ways in which it often does a less than perfect job. I want to borrow from Isaac Newton. Newton talked about inertia, which is the idea that an object that is at rest stays at rest. An object that's in motion continues in motion. So that's physical inertia. But there's a similar idea that we can import into our understanding of evolution, which is that an evolutionary system, once it moves in a particular direction, tends to continue in that direction. That's a function of how our genes work. So if you have a quadruped that has a spine that's spread horizontally, that supports all of its body weight, and it's evolutionarily cheap, which is to say you don't need a lot of genes to simply rotate that 90 degrees. So our spines are lousy because they're a continuation of a system that worked better in a different context. As Darwin put it, new systems are always built on top of old systems. And that means that there are going to be inefficiencies. The luxury of the engineer is to design things from scratch and say, what's the best possible solution? Evolution never has that luxury. Evolution is always working with what it has, descent with modification. The consequence is evolutionary inertia. We sometimes build new systems on top of old systems where the spare parts aren't really what we would like to have. So I'm going to give you a particular example, which is memory, and how that's been shaped by evolutionary inertia, and how that's changed some other properties of how we think about the world. So a perfect design for memory might be something like what computers do, where you would have a particular location for each piece of information that you want to store. So your computer knows where your music is stored, where your videos are stored, where your word processing documents are stored, and so forth. And you can think of that sort of like the way that a bank organizes safe deposits. Each customer has a particular box. Once you put something in that box, you expect it to stay there, and everything is organized by a kind of master map of which customer has which memory location. It would be really great if we had that for the human mind, but we don't. One of the reasons it would be great is once you store something, it would stay. So in a computer, you put a phone number in your address book, it stays there permanently. That doesn't happen for us. Instead, we have something more like a shoebox full of photographs. So before the digital era, you would collect all your photos in a shoebox, and maybe the ones you took most recently would be at the front, but if you wanted an older photograph, you just kind of have to riffle through them. And in particular, we rely on a system of cues that we share with every other creature on the planet, with rats and mice and even things like spiders. They all use something called cue-dependent memory or context-dependent memory. So what that means, for example, is the place in which you learn something helps you to remember it. It'd be easier for you to remember this lecture if you came back and sat in this room, for example, than if you went and sat on the beach. So the lecture room is a reminder of something that came before. And that's how our memory works. So it's always driven by reminders. There's something called posture-dependent memory. You're sitting down now, you'll remember the lecture better later if you're sitting down then. The consequence is that we get confused when a bunch of different memories have the same cues. So if you try to remember, for example, where you put your car and you park in the same garage every day, your memory just says, reminder, car, garage, and you wind up with all the memories of all the places you parked in the garage, and you have no idea where in the garage it actually is. Even worse, imagine that you are a skydiver, and you've skydove many, many times, and you want to pull the ripcord, but you can't actually remember if you've done it before because you confuse it together with all the other memories. What it says at the bottom of the slide, I found this statistic on the web, 6% of all skydiving fatalities can be traced to divers actually forgetting to pull the ripcord. So that's an amazing statistic about the limitations of the human memory. People actually die because they can't remember what they've done 2 minutes earlier. Once we were stuck with this lousy memory system, the nature of evolutionary inertia meant that other cognitive systems were impaired. So memory is kind of the center of all of our intellectual life. Josh Foro, I think, talk about this more later, but everything that we do goes through our memory systems, and that includes things like how we make our decisions. So, for example, if you have to decide whether to pay money to let me say that again. In our country, we have something called an estate tax, or we used to. This was a tax that people would pay, or the heirs of people that died would pay, and everybody was basically for it. And then they changed the name of it, just the name, not what it was, to the death tax. And that makes everybody think of the two worst things in life, death and taxes, the two worst inevitabilities. And now suddenly everybody was violently opposed to the death tax. So it had a dramatic effect on government policy. Similarly, I can describe a soap as 99% pure. Everybody is very excited by it. If I redescribe it as 1% toxic, everybody wants to put it back on the shelf. This is called the framing effect. And the question is, why does this matter? Why does the name of something make so much difference in how we think about it? Rationally, a death tax and an estate tax are the same thing, or this bar of soap is the same in both cases. Well, engineers have a good way of thinking about this, which is called garbage in, garbage out. And that notion is that our decision-making systems are only as good as the memories that we can summon. And because our memories are summoned by different random cues, we can't always get the best information, so we don't always make the best decisions. Similarly, there's something called the own work bias. So if two people share an apartment and you ask them, how much of the dishes did you do? I guarantee that the numbers will add up to more than 100%. Everybody always thinks that they've done more of the labor. Well, why is that? Because our memories are organized to remember what we did better than what other people remembered. This also leads to things like confirmation bias. Everybody thinks their own theory is right, their belief in a particular god or a particular political party, because we notice things that fit our theories better than we notice things that don't fit our theories. In a computer, you can just find information that doesn't match your theory. In the human mind, you're stuck with the cue-driven memory, so you remember what matches, and you wind up trusting yourself more than you actually should. Similar thing happens in mental illness. If you have a bad day at work, you come home, you think about that bad day at work, and then you think about the fight that you had with your girlfriend, and then you start listening to blues music, and you get into this, what I call ruminative cycle, where things just seem worse and worse. Because context-dependent memory gives you other things that are cued and are equally sad. You can see the same kind of mechanism at work in paranoia. So to summarize so far, In many ways, the human mind is the crown jewel of evolution. We've got democracy, we've got philosophy, but that doesn't make it perfect or even the best compromise that's imaginable. Sometimes people talk about the mind as being optimal, but it's not even that. It's not even the best that we could do. It's just the best that evolution could cobble together given the spare parts that were around when we evolved from an ancestral animal that was much like a chimpanzee. So we are not the product of intelligent design. And although a lot of our mental machinery is elegant, a lot of it with a little bit of foresight could be a lot better. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because of the decisions we make. For example, if you go into a grocery store and you see a sign that says limit 12 and you want to buy a can of soup, you look at that sign and you say, this is a ridiculous sign. Who would buy 12 cans of soup? I don't even need 11 or 10 or 9. And you walk out of the store having bought 8 cans of soup because your memory has posed the problem in a particular way for your decision making. Young children in America apparently prefer their vegetables if they come in a McDonald's wrapper. It's the same thing, queuing of memory driving our decisions. Personal choices. I took this from a billboard in Chicago. It says, life's short, get a divorce. Well, there's another study. This wasn't up for very long, but I bet that it in fact increased the divorce rate. It was put up by a lawyer in Chicago. There were a big protest. It turns out that if you, at a car dealership, say, how likely are you to buy a car in the next 6 months? People are more likely to buy just because they've heard the question. So you can imagine this billboard had a similar context. Political choices are also driven by minor details of our memory. For example, if you go into a school when you vote, you're more likely to be in favor of schools because the school becomes more salient in your mind. If you vote on the same referendum about how much taxes should go to a school, but you do it in a cafeteria that has nothing to do with a school, you'll give it less money. So all these things working below the surface because of the dynamics of our memory, because we can't systematically search our memory banks in the way that computers could. So what should we do about this? What I think we should do is to change our education system. So traditionally, at least in my country, a lot of education is about drilling children on facts, teaching them the names of state capitals and things like that, that nowadays they can just look up on Wikipedia. You know, many facts are very easily accessible. There's some you're always going to have to know, like you're always going to have to memorize the times table. But a lot of the facts that we teach children in school, we might not need to. Now would give us more time to teach them other things. Of course, you can't change the curriculum unless you find the time. I think we should find the time by having less facts. And instead, I think what we should do is to teach children something about the limitations of their own minds. So where the human mind is vulnerable to bias, where our reasoning system breaks down, where our memories can't be trusted, some of the kinds of things that I taught you today. And there's good evidence that curricula like philosophy for kids that encourage thinking about thinking or metacognition seem to be on the right track. I noticed that Andres has a book about thinking about thinking. That's what I think we need to teach children, is to think about their own cognitive abilities and where they go wrong. We're not born understanding how our brain works any better than we were born understanding how our stomach works or how our heart works. We have to learn these things. If we learn how our brain works, we can make better decisions. So the bottom line, as they say in a group in the States called Alcoholics Anonymous, is recognition is the first step. The first step towards improving ourselves is to realize that our minds are limited. Thinking that the human mind is perfect, like in the Homo economicus model, is egocentric. It's outmoded. It's like thinking that the universe revolves around the Earth. Maybe it made sense to believe that 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, but there's overwhelming data now that we're not perfect thinkers. So the bottom line is the human mind is pretty good, but evolutionary inertia makes us rough around the edges. Because evolution uses the same spare parts over and over again, sometimes not the most appropriate parts for a job, there are things that don't work so well. If we can face those limitations honestly, we might just have a chance to outwit our inner kludge. And I thank you very much.
Gary, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
I know that you're writing a new book of how people like me or people that is 40 years or older can learn to play guitar.
That's right.
Could you
tell
us a little bit about it?
I think of my new book. It's called Guitar Zero, which is a play on a video game called Guitar Hero, where you pretend to be a rock and roll star. I think of this book as my midlife crisis book. It's about, what a person can do when they're 40. Can you reinvent yourself? So when I was a child, I tried to learn to play recorder, that instrument sort of like a flute, and I was so bad I got kicked out of class. The teacher suggested I might find better things to do with my time. But I always loved music, and when I had a little bit of time off after a number of years, I decided this was my chance. I was going to try. And so this book, Guitar Zero, is about adults and kids and how they learn differently, and it's about how human beings with their kludgy minds manage to learn music. And there's also a lot of fun interviews with rock stars and music teachers and so forth.
Thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Gracias.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.